But Sarah's research, as we'll learn some about today, concerns the Japanese industrial and furniture design industries in the 20th century. She studied in Japan, received her PhD from the University of Tokyo in interdisciplinary cultural studies. She's an author. She's written a book, or been the co-author of a book called 20th Century Design History with a Tokyo-based design journalist, Watabe Chiharu. And is currently working on a book called Modern Japanese Design. Sarah is an assistant professor here in the Department of Art History. Unfortunately, we're losing her. She is, in January, going to be joining the Royal College of Art in London as a tutor in the history of design and critical and historical studies. But fortunately, as a final parting act, Sarah has been organizing a conference entitled Toward History of Design in the Global Economy, which will be held here on December 5th.
And features your very own Professor Elizabeth Gerber.
And Professor, your very own Elizabeth Gerber in the back there, hiding away. So that may be something that she may be able to tell you a bit more about, and you might be interested in attending.
Neat. Today I'll be talking about, as you can see from the screen, exhibition design and strategies for national branding in post-war Japan. There's a subtitle for this, or how the Japanese government used display design as international PR on 2 occasions and what we can learn from this. So I am a design historian, and as you've heard, my interest today, or my interest more broadly, is how can we use history to hopefully improve our own practices as designers in daily life, and in your case as professional designers as well. So we're going to be shifting to, last week we heard from Steve Fisher on the importance of attending to style and fashion and luxury. The importance for a number of reasons, partly because of the massive impact they have on our economy. Today we're going to be shifting gears a small bit. We're going to be looking at the impact that style, but rather than style meaning fashion and the fashion industry, style in the sense of styling design, more broadly expanded out to display design or the packaging of things, how this can affect not only what we choose to buy or not buy, but actually much larger issues such as whether nations gain or are able to regain their international standing after disastrous wars. So we're going to be looking at 2 examples of how the Japanese government in the last 150 years used what I'm calling display design. So the design of exhibition spaces or the display of products. How they use display design tactics and strategies to try and influence international opinion, and the effect of these design strategies on Japan's standing in the world order. So we're looking at this question of design being used as part of international diplomacy, not only for economic results. Japan is going to want to sell its products as part of the reason it will be displaying products in the exhibitions that you'll be looking at, but it's also very much about using visual cues in relation to other design strategies and other design practices being done in the world at this time, other ways of displaying objects, to try and create a certain image of Japan. So very much, we could also call this sort of studies in national packaging. Only instead of talking about the packaging of one can on a shelf, we're talking about one country among many. Okay, so here we have an image. The title of the talk is of course Post-War Japan, and that begs a small question. Which war are we talking about? Well, we're actually going to be talking about the Second World War, or when I use in the title Post-War Japan, I'm talking about the Second World War, so Japanese design in the late 1940s, early 1950s. But we're going to look at, like I said, 2 instances, and one of them is from a few decades earlier. In fact, it's this image right here. Any idea what we might be looking at, or what period we might be looking at, or where in the world we might be looking at? Pardon?
World's Fair.
Yeah, it is a World's Fair. Okay, anyone want to hazard some approximate dates. 1851. Okay, it's a bit later than that. This is actually from 1876. So this is at the Philadelphia the Centennial Exposition, the U.S.'s first big international exhibition held in Philadelphia in 1876. And this is the first time that Japan will show its products at an international exhibition or a World's Fair. In the United States. So this is the first time that Japanese goods will be marketed in any large quantity in the United States. And I'll talk more about the World's Fair system and this why display design was so important for countries during the late 19th century later on. But for now, let's look at this image a bit more. Who do you think? Okay, so we've established it's 1876, Philadelphia. I've framed it in the context of a talk about Japanese display design, so obviously there's a relationship to Japan. And we have in the center here a man who looks like he may well be Japanese. Okay, who do you think created this image? What do you think the subtext or the sort of the context? Now we know the context. The subtext. What is the message of this image? Who do you think created it? Yeah.
Looks like it was created by the Japanese because it's the center. Their Japanese item is the center of the picture, and all the Americans have copied and touching it. So
Okay.
maybe it's probably from the Japanese perspective.
Okay. Good guess. So you say it's from the Japanese perspective because we have a Japanese man and Japanese objects. I haven't told you that yet, but these are Japanese objects down the center of the image. And you said, I like that phrase, Americans are gawking at him. Okay, well this is actually, it's an American artist's representation of the Japanese pavilion. So you were half right and half wrong, but what I like about your answer is that you notice and you verbalize very well that what do we have here? I mean, this isn't just the Japanese pavilion or the Japanese exhibit in Philadelphia. This is Americans gawking at the Japanese pavilion in Philadelphia. Right? We have this Japanese man in the center who almost visually, so you're getting a little bit of sort of art historical image analysis here as well, but this Japanese man at the center who, because of the form of his body, because of the darkness, he's in line with this very ornate, very elaborate Japanese bronze urn as well. And then we have these Americans looking around. Some of them are chatting with their friends, but others are either gawking at or looking at, to put it in points more politely, or enthralled with, or fascinated by the urn and the man himself. Okay, so we have this image of Americans being fascinated by the Japan that was presented at the exhibition. Okay, and what do you think they're thinking of from? I mean, this is an illustration. It accompanies an article. What are the Americans thinking about Japan at this exhibition?
Exoticism.
Okay, so elaborate.
Well, this is almost like seeing somebody from the moon, I think, so to speak. I mean, it's that far afield from their experiences.
Okay, yeah, we have someone who looks incredibly exotic. Okay, yeah.
The two people touching it are female, and so it appears as though they're more into how ornate it is, and the men that are standing at it from a distance are just looking at how foreign it looks.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, we have this combination of the ornateness of the objects and then the foreignness of it, the exoticness of it. Like Russ says, the fact that this could be from the moon. Okay, or in particular, this man could be from the moon. You have this Japanese man. He's wearing traditional Japanese clothing. So he's not wearing a Western suit. He's wearing a Japanese men's kimono, and there's this sort of really interesting dialogue going on, or sort of exchange going on, where you have the Western, the American man looking at him, and then you have him looking at whoever's making the picture, and then whoever's looking at making the picture is able to see both of them at the same time. So we're really, we're catching this dialogue or this sort of exchange going on in the image. Yeah.
I was going to say that guy in the front on the right almost looks offended by the
Okay, he definitely doesn't look happy, does he? I mean, he looks. We could use the word sort of worried by, perturbed by. Yeah, he's definitely on his guard. There's something not quite right about this. Okay. Well, this is all. I like using this image because it tells us a lot about, actually, or it very well describes the American reaction to what I'm calling Japanese display design, or the way that Japan displayed itself at the World's Fair, the way that it displayed its products. So these types of ornamental artistic crafts that were on sale in Philadelphia, but also the nation of Japan itself as embodied by this man, who is one of the fair commissioners. So he's actually a high-ranking government official, very likely from a high-ranking former samurai family in Japan, very well educated, extremely elite. And you have these American men especially who are sort of like, well, what are you doing? What's going on here? You don't quite fit the way that we expect the civilized world to look. Yeah?
It almost looks to like the artist went out of his way to make him like darker and like a lot. Like, I don't know, it doesn't look particularly Japanese, like it seems very dark, like almost African American.
Okay. Yeah, now we also have these very racialized overtones in here of this man who is not white.
Yeah.
Okay.
So that's
Yeah, and that's really important. I mean, what we're going to see is in the late 19th century, Japan begins, as most industrializing nations are at this point, sending over delegations to and creating exhibits for the international exhibitions that are being held almost annually at this point in countries around the world, from Argentina, Australia, France, Belgium, Canada, the United States, Japan, etc.
You said this was Philadelphia.
Yeah, this is actually Philadelphia. Oh, my good heavens, is this Chicago? Okay, I need to check that because I'm fairly sure it actually is Philadelphia. But either way, it actually works, because what I'm going to argue to you is that there's a radical shift in Japanese sort of design of the way that the Japanese government displays themselves and their products before and after a set of two wars. The Sino-Japanese War of 1893 and the Russo-Japanese War of 1904. Okay, so let's jump to 1904. We're now going to be in Chicago, so we've gone down river a bit. Sorry, St. Louis. I'm sort of having a bit of time lag here. So we're now in St. Louis. The 1904 Louisiana Purchase Exposition was held. It was supposed to commemorate the anniversary of the purchase of Louisiana by the Americans. It was held a year late in 1904, and the Japanese, as do many other nations and American states, participate in this as well. And what I'd like to do is contrast the way that Japan is represented in one of the official guidebooks to the fair with that image you got from Philadelphia, possibly Chicago. Okay, so what I've done is I've taken out a few excerpts of text. I want you all to take a second, read over the text, and tell me what your image of, or what the American image of Japan is here. This is an excerpt from the official guide's official Japan section.
Certainly would not have written that in 1945.
And you'll see they write things, well, very, very different things in 1945, actually in 1985 as well. Okay, so what is the image of Japan, or what image, I mean, you haven't seen yet the image that Japan displays of itself in St. Louis. What you're getting is the American reaction, the St. Louis people's reaction to it. So what is their image of Japan at this point?
Peaceful.
Okay.
Beautiful.
Beautiful, peaceful. We might look at, distinguished Japanese noblemen with stately courtesy, large pavilions, general reception rooms, feudal days of the sword-carrying samurai. But we do have this sort of odd bit of, well, peaceful, but at the same time, peaceful model Japanese house, fresh, clean matting betokening comfort. And Japan is businesslike and modern. 20 clerks engaged in the business of routine work. And this is also something you might see if you go visit. But then we have this odd sentence here: the only hint of war in the entire Japanese exhibit is in this room, in the display of the Red Cross Society. It's like, hang on, it's this very civilized, lovely country with ancient tradition and modern business practices. And what's this about war? Right? And then
But I wonder if that speaks to America, that the American exhibit probably bragged of their war prowess and machine, and that's why I wonder if that's what it is.
Well, what we actually are going to find is that St. Louis, like I said, Japan in 1904 is actually engaged with Russia. At the time this fair is on, Japan and Russia are in the midst of pitched naval battles and land battles on the Korean Peninsula in northern China and in northern China. Meanwhile, the Japanese have this very elegant pavilion in St. Louis, and they're going to take the World's Fair, the pavilion architecture, the objects they show, the way they arrange the objects, and the way that they write their own guidebooks as a kind of diplomacy as well, to try and sway American opinion to their side during the war. And this is actually going to work out to the Japanese advantage. The war ends in 1905. The Japanese and the Russians convene in New Hampshire, where President Teddy Roosevelt brokers a treaty, the Portsmouth Treaty, in which Japan wins and annexes Korea as a result. And so this is, I mean, when I talk about how display design can do more than just sell your products, it can actually win you a war, and it can influence international opinion. This is exactly what I mean. Okay, so we've gone from, this image of the, oddly dark, rather, rough-looking Japanese samurai in the center of this image being stared at by these elegant Americans, to the Japanese, who are, a people in the art of war and the pursuits of peace, are steadily making their way to a large place in world power. Okay, so what we're really seeing is the ascension of Japan as a nation to this sort of this club of civilized nations in the early 20th century. Okay. And it's sort of this combination of the perfection of the expression of artistic beauty, the understanding of the traditional classical Japanese historical arts, and the ability not only to do modern accounting, but also modern war. So that's the impression that they're giving. Let's look at what the display design, I'll give you one more example. Here, this is the top of that article. Japan's extraordinary exhibit, a wonderful display that tells the most remarkable story of commercial and industrial achievement in modern history. It's not the English, it's not the Germans, it's not the Americans, it's the Japanese. So let's look at how they do this, because this is going to be, and you can sort of go back and look at the Japanese documents from the Planning Commission, and it was very carefully, this entire exhibit, designed to give exactly this impression. Okay, this combination of civilization and modern military and political prowess. Yes?
What country is working to do that? I just would imagine at a world fair that would be your goal.
Okay, I mean, some nations do it better than others. I mean, this is going to, and I'll talk about this in a second. I mean, this is at World's Fairs, the goal is, of course, to sell your products, convince people of your economic, military, political might. Some countries, for example, China, fail at this fairly dramatically. And there's been a lot of research done on how the actual design of the Chinese exhibits influence that. And people would talk about going to them and it looked like a jumble sale.
But the goals are similar, though.
The goals are similar. Yeah. So what I'm showing is, it's sort of two examples, and I could be picking other countries besides Japan for this, but there's some Japanese examples that fail miserably as well. But this 1904 St. Louis, and then the examples I'll be showing you from the 1950s after the Second World War, are particularly, to my mind, compelling examples of how powerful display design can be to influence opinion. So here's what we'd actually see if we visit the Japanese pavilion. You'd go in this gate. This is all in the style of Edo period, so 17th, 18th century Japanese architecture. It's a combination of military architecture, sort of military residential, so warrior family architecture and temple architecture, and imperial household architecture, this sort of this amalgam that looks very Japanese. And it was, many people talked about at the time how it it looked so Japanese. And it had to do partly with the carpentry methods, with the materials used, with the roof lines, with these, these decorations taken from Shinto shrines. So everything visually about it, about the site, looked Japanese. So we walk in. Here, this is the main exhibition space right here. It's modeled on a part of the imperial family's palace in the Shinden style of architecture, which is from about 1,000 years ago. Parallel bays with this roof here. This is incidentally, this building is now in upstate New York. Here's what it looked like 2 summers ago. But here's what, so there's sort of the coloration of it. But here is how it looked in the context of the St. Louis World's Fair, so set in this garden. So you have this combination of military architecture, clear architectural skill, from centuries ago in this beautiful garden setting. And here is another way that American visitors to the fair saw it. This was a popular a newspaper photographer. It was one of the St. Louis newspapers. I forget which one, but one of their photographers' representations of it. So over here we had the building that I just showed you, and then down here this was a scale replica, not to complete scale, of the Golden Pavilion, one of the most famous temples in the city of Kyoto. And then a little tea house right here. Bronze crane sculptures sort of plonked around to give you the feeling that you're in a Japanese garden with the birds wandering. And in the background, you have the Ferris wheel. So you get an idea of the scale and also just the drama of this difference. Inside, so that was the official Japanese government pavilion. The Japanese also had exhibitions in different parts of the fair. So this is the entrance to what was called the arts manufacturers section. So this was the industrial products, but industrial products meaning ceramics, cloisonne, metalwork, the kinds of these giant brass urns, lanterns, this kind of thing. You can see it's a large steel structure, and then inside you have this very ornate, again, 17th century, early 18th century Japanese gate. With the words Japan right there, just in case you don't know from looking at it who you're looking at. Also these very large flags here. This is a black and white photograph, of course, but this was incredibly brightly colored. So it's red, green, yellow, blue, all this very ornate carving. These are all white. The tiles, I'm not sure what color the tiles were, but it's this very, there's gold leaf and metalwork here, so it's this very bright, flashy, fairly bold statement. And it's modeled after the gate to the tomb of one of the great warlords of Japan. So just in case there wasn't enough sort of military force imagery already happening. So you'd have this type of statement. Inside in some of the exhibits, the paragraph I had to read was talking about the exhibits of the samurai and their families. So there were exhibits of all sorts of things, but including the Japanese costumes of the Middle Ages was the caption for this one. Various Japanese warriors from the 14th, 15th, 16th centuries. And then this was an exhibit. This St. Louis World's Fair is quite infamous for having a primitive peoples area where Aboriginal peoples from different colonized parts of the globe were plonked down in a village together, and the Americans and other visitors to the fair could go and tour and look at their primitive ways. The historian Robert Rydell has written quite a lot about this. The Japanese, by this point, have also started expanding their colonies in Asia fairly aggressively, and so they brought over some of the Ainu peoples from the northernmost island of Japan and included them as well. So you not only get, the Japanese are militarily strong, but oh look, the Japanese are more civilized than other peoples in their land. I mean, I'm putting that in a rather crude way, but it was a fairly crude way of presenting this in St. Louis as well. Okay, so that's all been sort of a long introduction to the first of the 2 themes that we'll be looking at for the rest of the class today. Or the first theme, design and modernity. So design as a national branding practice. And this really begins, it begins before 1851, but it'll be the most strongest, or really come to sort of be quite visible from 1851 and the decades of the international international expositions. question for us, are we in a transnational or a post-national age today? Do we still, I mean, does this type of design, this sort of national design and this national branding, does this still happen in our world? If so, where is it? Do we do this, or are we in some kind of post-national branding age? Now that so much capital is not bounded by national boundaries, now that corporations are multinational, is there a different type of sort of object of this type of design that we see? Okay, are we in a different age, or are we still seeing this type of or design used in this way to make a statement about nations? Okay, and how does this affect designers' work, packaging designers, but also the type of work that you all will be doing, or that you already are doing, dealing much more with products and their use? Second question is just this power of display design, and clearly I should have powered up the color of this type a bit brighter. Sorry it's so dark. The power of display design, the relationship between a designed product and the design of its display. How important is the design of display? If a product is good, shouldn't that have everything to do with it? Shouldn't that be enough? Or on the other hand, can products be overpowered by their display? What exactly is being displayed when you show, when the Japanese showed a pot behind that giant gate? Okay, so the question for us, somewhat long, but how as designers of objects, systems, ways of working, and ways of being in space or relating to our environment, do you use and or otherwise relate to display design? How can designers of things, material and immaterial, use display design to your advantage? And a quick sort of definition, my definition of design, some of you have heard this before, I think, but it's a planned intervention into the environment. So I've been showing you examples of sort of very obvious designs of space, but I think of design as something much more broad. So the type of work that Professor Norman does, the type of architecture, anything from designing a system to designing a water bottle to designing the label for a water bottle, and just a few illustrations of design. This is from the Boston Museum of Science's website. It's how they explain design engineering to elementary school students. I'm not sure what you all will be able to critique that better than I can as something effective or not. Design as a discipline, design as a type of education or an educational area, design as the drawing of something which you then make, design as a commodity, particularly today, something that we say, oh, that's design, I want to own that. Design as the intervention into space, changing the way that we interact with space. Design as the writing of something. Design as a sketch. Design as designed experience, a la Disney. So that's where I'm coming from when I say design. And you've already hopefully gotten an image of what I mean by display design. So I've said the word Crystal Palace and 1851 a few times, just to refresh those. I mean, I'm sure many of you have already learned about World's Fairs over and over again, but for those of you, and for myself too, who are a bit dusty with this, the late 19th century is marked by massive international expositions in which countries, first in Europe, but then also increasingly in Asia, in North America, and also the colonies of countries in the West and in Asia, in Africa, Latin America, American states, etc., would show their products. The idea being, like I've said a few times, to show your industrial might, mark your place in the world, mark your place in this world order that's about jostling for position. Britain has the first large industrial fair, so it's taking an industrial trade fair and amping up the volume quite a lot, adding a level of popular entertainment, and also a level of sort of the way when we might think about the Olympics today, this idea of spectacle and showing off. Only instead of using athletes' bodies and pyrotechnics, it was about products and architecture to a large extent. So this is the Crystal Palace exhibition in London, a few images of that. This massive glass building, it burned down in the 1930s. but it was quite monumental from the outside, really a show of British engineering, ingenuity, fabrication methods, and on the inside, you had this incredibly brightly colored, just sort of plethora of sort of encyclopedic, only not even in any kind of intelligible order, just massive things and people, stuff for sale, people to look at, things to marvel at. Okay, and this is everything from paintings to the latest, steam engines, to beans, to people, to like anything possibly you could think of that could be produced by a nation. Okay. Japan first, so these begin in 1851. Japan first participates, as I've said, in Philadelphia, or in the United States, sorry, take that back, in Philadelphia in 1876. Here's an image of the type of display that Japan does for the first few exhibitions. And I think you'll agree with me, it's a bit messy. And it looks a bit like someone's back storeroom or like a department store that hasn't really thought about how to display its wares so that people will want to buy them yet. You have this pyramid of cloisonné and ceramics and various very dramatic objects. I'll give you an example of one of the types, these, whoops, here. Incredibly elaborate objects that are being displayed. This is one, it's a sort of an ornamental, it's actually an incense burner. It's about just over a foot tall. You can see an example of a much larger one in the back right here. And it really shows off the skills of Japan's artisans. So it's metal workers, it's ceramicists, it's woodworkers, these incredibly lifelike birds, for example, and this incredibly ornate decoration. A lot of the products they show are incredibly large, like these massive bronze incense burners. These are about 6 feet tall, and just encrusted with these tiny little, incredibly ornate Victorian, what we would think of as a Victorian aesthetic. These massive objects, and they also have tiny little objects that would make you marvel at the intricacy of their detail. This is Chicago, 1893. While Japan still hasn't really progressed so much in terms of displaying things. Again, we just have which vase to choose, and you're sort of overwhelmed by the volume of vases or the volume of decoration. At least that's my reading. Any other readings from you all on how you would feel upon encountering this? Yeah.
I'm just curious if this display, speaks of the time, because Victorian decorating is very crammed and cluttered, and people liked it. And I don't know why they did, but that was the way they decorated their homes, and so this might be to them very attractive and look very rich and vibrant, and in a way that for them was beautiful design.
Yeah, and that's what you've pointed to really is that yes, this looks rather Victorian, for lack of a better word. If there wasn't that caption up there, how would we know this was Japanese and not from somewhere else, say in Europe?
But I would say it also looks very similar to some of the shopping districts in Japan, like in Tokyo right now. All the neighborhoods are kind of organized by type of where, like there's the ceramic area, and there's the kitchen stuff, and there's the motorcycle area. And the stores are very much like this. When you walk in, there's just little stacks of ceramics, and vases and tea sets, all kind of ready to talk about each other. So.
Okay, yeah.
I do think that the sheer volume of all of these available is sort of cheaper the craft. Is that there's so many of them that feel like none of it would be unavailable if there's no more.
Okay, yeah.
I just want to amplify this. This really strikes me as the funny contradiction I always feel when I go to Japan. That the image that we have is like the first passage that you gave us, which is elegant Japanese gardens with almost nothing there, empty space, carefully laid out. But when you go into the city, it's much more like this. It's chaotic, it's ugly, it's loud, it's noisy, it's garish. And so the Japanese have these two sides to them. It appears to me this may just be.
Well, it's also, I think, and that image of Japan is very serene, and so I won't have time to go into that today, but that has a lot to do with the marketing of Japan after the Second World War. So I'll be on to something near to that. But the image of Japan that was presented here was very specifically that very empty. Actually, you will see some images of that in a few minutes. I want to go back to something you said, though, but well, that looks kind of Victorian. I mean, that's sort of exactly the point. I mean, the idea was that they have all of this stuff that if you look at it very closely, it's, my God, the skill of these artisans. And it looks somehow exotic, and it's exotic enough that you'll be interested in it and you'll buy it. Meanwhile, wow, there was a lot of craft and a lot of learning that went into this. You couldn't just pick up a chisel and make that tomorrow, right? So you have these centuries of traditions of ways of making. But in the meantime, any of this stuff could fit in a Victorian living room. And the display design itself is pretty not uncommon for, sorry, that's a convoluted way of saying, it looks Victorian. It doesn't look that out of place. And so what they're really going after, and I think that the quote that you saw from the St. Louis reaction, what we're getting is this idea that, oh, you know, the Japanese, they're slowly, you know, sort of in the decades after, in the late 19th century and into the early 20th century, fitting into sort of Western, or what are sort of understood to be cosmopolitan or powerful nations' ways of doing things, whether it has to do with how do you run your military, how do you beat a neighbor nation in war, or how do you organize your stuff in an exhibition. And if you take this, you know, this space right here, it could fit very nicely in your living room in Evanston in 1890. And a lot of this, actually, the Field Museum in downtown Chicago does have a lot of these things now. Yeah.
Just out of curiosity, who organizes these exhibits?
It's the Japanese ministries, and it depends on the year who does it. It's usually a special delegation.
And are they designed, what is their design training, or what would be their background influencing perhaps the way they set it?
Yeah. It depends. It depends on the year. Sometimes, I mean, it's always an architect who does the buildings.
Sure.
The display design itself was often people involved in the design industry. What was this? There was a design exports promotion section in the government, and it flowed around from different ministries. Sometimes it was and it could be in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Sometimes it was the Ministry of Education. They moved it around a few times over the decades. But it would be someone who was involved in design promotion. So more like less a hands-on designer and more the design strategy person. There was actually one design educator who was involved in these for several years, and he was in charge of St. Louis. Pardon?
It's almost 5 and we haven't gotten to the Second World War.
Oh, well, we're about to, yes. I'm conscious of time. You know, we started 15 minutes late, so I'm about 15 minutes after. Just an image to reinforce all this. This is the Japanese in Chicago in 1893. And again, this, you know, using the exotic, but also it's this like exotic but the weight of the centuries. The Japanese pavilion in the foreground based on an 11th century temple in Kyoto compared to the massive white city in the background. And just some more of the objects that would have been displayed. So this one on the right, this is actually a Belgian design, but the Japanese start taking an Art Nouveau as well. And it's not just this, underline the fact that it's not just the objects, the architecture, the space, but it's also the Japanese self-presentation of the officials. This is how Japanese men dressed for ceremonial, for formal occasions in Japan in the 1870s. Here we have a representation. This is, you know, we very soon switched to Japanese men in formal situations in Western suits. But with the judicious breaking out of traditional clothing when useful. Okay, so rather sharp, and I did this without any announcement, a rather dramatic change we're now going to be looking at after the Second World War. Another example of display design to try and influence international opinion. Here we have Tokyo, August 1945, after the American B-52 bombers have been over it a few times. In the late 19th century, Japan just had to convince the world it was civilized and did not deserve to be conquered by a more powerful nation and colonized. In 1945, Japan had to convince the world that it was not evil, basically. It had to, we have Japan, which has just been the aggressor in a brutal war in East Asia for 15 years. After Pearl Harbor, etc., Japan has been the enemy. Now Japan is in rubble, as you can see. Most large Japanese cities look pretty much like this. And now it has to try and, well, get its economy back on track, rebuild the country, but also somehow try and rebuild its international reputation. So what are you going to do? Okay. And once again, exhibition design is going to be a way of doing this. This time, no, it's going to be less about the World's fairs and more about trade fairs. And this is this is a fairly common strategy after the Second World War internationally for countries that had been reduced to rubble during the war. The idea being that you rebuild your economy slowly, largely through exports, through the gaining of foreign currency. How do you get exports? Of course, you show your work or your products at international trade fairs. So a lot of countries in Western Europe will also be doing this. First, of course, you have to rebuild your manufacturing base. Here's, sorry, just a little timeline for you. 1945, the end of the Pacific War. 1945 to 52, Allied occupation of Japan. Primarily American troops in Japan. 1950 to 53, the Korean War, so that overlaps. The Japanese economy will get a boost with supplying the Americans fighting in the Korean War, and partly, or sort of in large part, due to the Korean War. In 1955, the Japanese Ministry of the Economy announces it is no longer the post-war era. We are back to, we have recovered from the war. Okay, so it's about 10 years. And display design is going to help do that economically. Of course, unlike somewhere like France or Belgium, Japan also has the issue of it somehow has to, like I've said, salvage its international reputation. And it also does that in large part through things like trade fairs. Here's just some examples of how people rebuild the economy or rebuild manufacturing and product design. This is a government-published design magazine called Industrial Art News. It's a monthly magazine. They start publishing designs for objects that could be used at home, but then also exported, often based on the types of objects, the furniture, the houses, the pots and pans that the American occupying forces were using. And so the idea is you're going to be exporting, you're going to be using that special link with the occupation and the special link that Japan then has to the U.S. to establish the U.S. as a market, or to really get your products into the U.S. market. Okay. Japan's first exports are actually to England, though, in 1948. This is a very bad image, but it was crafts products like bamboo chairs, small objects. And this was really sort of a trial, because Japan didn't actually restart exports until the following year. And that had to do with economic sanctions on Japanese companies, the way that, and you could export things, but you had to go through the occupation authorities. And it was quite complicated, in fact, incredibly complicated. Okay, so Japan can't actually export objects. It can't participate in international trade fairs, which are one of the major ways of getting foreign buyers. So they actually start doing a few things. They work on products at home. They also start critiquing and thinking about display design strategies. We don't have very many, we don't know very much about how display design was researched in the late 19th century, but during the American occupation in the late 40s, there were people whose job it was to research effective display design for trade fairs. And they would publish articles about this in trade journals, saying, look, you can't just make a good pot, you can't just make an aluminum pot the Americans will use, you have to display it in a way that will make that buyer want to get it for their department store. And they would review exhibitions that were held in Japan and overseas and critique them. Write out these critiques in long detail so that everyone could say, okay, now that's an effective strategy. Okay, remember to do this, don't do that. This is just some examples from a show that was held in Tokyo and was violently critiqued as looking messy. And again, like people just plonked things down on a table. This is an exhibition of model rooms in a sort of an imaginary American house that was also held in Tokyo around the same time. And this, the point of this exhibition wasn't just to, this was not Japanese manufacturers, this was much more, here's the American way of life, look what you too could have if you can rebuild your country and get democracy. So there are quite a lot of political underpinnings in here as well. But why I'm showing you this is that this is an example of the kind of article that I was talking about. It's a man who's trained as an industrial designer, he's trained in art and architectural history, but then becomes an industrial designer and an industrial design educator in the late 1940s, works for a government research institute. This is an article called Two Exhibitions, and he's talking about how this American exhibition is effective and the Japanese one is completely useless because these objects are being used, or they look like an actual place that you would use them, and so you'd want to use them, whereas this, you know, you would not actually have 12 dishes set out, or, 12 cups set out in the middle of your dining table. But you might actually, be pulling a roast out of your oven or reading the magazine and going to get something. So he's critiquing it from the terms of effective exhibition design. Just one more example of that. This is the same guy whose name is Koike. According to him, this is from another article of his on good display design strategies, also from the late 1940s. He said the best way to do it is to have a fictional family involved. So you don't just have, a magazine plonked down, in like a glass of scotch, like someone's just gotten up, but you actually say, that scotch belongs to Mr. McQuarrie. He's a, mid-ranking company official in a small town or a medium-sized town in Scotland. He has a wife, she likes to paint, he enjoys golfing, they have a son who's in engineering school. Now imagine what their house would look like. Now use your products, put those products in that room, and that will sell to buyers. So they're doing quite a lot of research, and they're looking at American display design strategies, at European ones, etc. So they're getting information from outside, but very carefully thinking about how do you show your stuff. Okay, so based on that, what would you imagine Japan's trade fair exhibition displays would look like once Japan does start exporting again? The first sort of big participation in trade fairs will be after the occupation ends in 1953. And I'm just going to show you a few examples of the mid-50s, and then I'll close out with one example of an American response to sort of an American display based on Japanese display design, or sort of an American take on what Japanese design is and what Japan is based on the image the Japanese have sold in that period. So what kind of things might we expect to see? It's a rather large question. But well, we might expect to see, sort of like...
Set us up to say objects in use.
Well, I have set you up to say that, yes. And so the fact that everyone is being quiet and saying, well, that's a really silly question, don't ask us that, is quite thoughtful on your part. So what we actually get is actually not, it's actually exoticism. And again, these images are these are very rare images that have been scanned online, and I've taken them from the online version, and so on and so on and so on, from bad paper. But they don't blow up very well at all. I've mentioned there was a government design research institute, and they're going to be in charge of the post-war. And they're a branch of JETRO, which you may have heard of. It's the Japan External Trade Relations Organization, so a government exports promotion board or organization. And they organize the fairs, and then what was this IARI, which is a branch of the Japanese, so the Ministry of International Trade and Industry, or MIDI, which is not called that now, but was at the time. So they'll design it, and then JETRO will fund it or sponsor it. This is 1953, so Japan's first sort of tryout, and I've sort of been saying they needed not only to get their economy kickstarted, or not kickstarted, but really grow their exports, but they also needed to somehow, fix their international image. So Japan is sending over theater troops, dance troops. Japanese films are showing at international film festival. Literature is being translated. There's this real push, also sponsored very much by the American occupation, to rehabilitate Japan's image as a very cultured country, a very humanist country, a very artistic country. And so the designers for this 1953 fair take that somewhat to heart and used a lot of sort of traditional craft products and craft textures for this really sort of Orientalist gift shop looking effect, which doesn't really look like anything you'd actually see in a Japanese house or business. So for example, we have tea whisks standing up here, fans up in the corner, sort of a display of ceramics, and of course these are the products that are being marketed to American buyers, to Canadian buyers, to international buyers, but the effect is also really one of kitsch. Okay, a few more examples. This is of lacquer, traditional woven textiles. sliding screens, this very sort of like handmade Japanese aesthetic. And this designer is actually going to come under a lot of critique from his peers in Tokyo for a sort of self-exotification. Well, flash ahead 3 years to Toronto, 1956, same designer. All of a sudden, we have this sort of sleek, internationally recognizable modern style. So all of a sudden, we have collapsible steel or metal furniture. We have giant these like giant blown-up photos on the walls instead. We have right angles. We have clean lines. We have spareness. It's very much what happens is they say, oh, we should be using what's looked at as what's seen as modern now, and then we can not only be a culture nation, we can also be part of the modern economy. Just for contrast, this is 2 years earlier. Finland, their display in an Italian major fair, the Milan Triennale, very similar use of these blown-up photographs. Again, it's not somebody's house. It's still objects on tables. You could have, sit here and have a conversation with the buyer from the department store here and your JETRO official there about what to do. But it's, we've sort of brought Japan up into the modern age through this very modern design. Well, what's ironic about that, or what also helps, is that this is the time when modern architects, modern designers in the United States, in Europe, are starting to say, hey, Japanese design was already modern. If the modern style is about what Don was talking about, very pared down, empty, minimalist, Zen, they're like, hey, we know how to do that, we can do that. But they don't want to be entirely trapped in that. So they're sort of in this funny place where they're trying to appeal to the Zen-esqueness. This is the walkway from a Buddhist temple that's been photographed in the rain. But at the same time, they want to look modern at the same time. So I'll close out just with one example of the effect of sort of this accumulated years of display design or sort of marketing of Japanese images. In the United States, in 1954, MoMA, the Museum of Modern Art in New York, opens up in their garden. You can see we've got the buildings of Manhattan right behind here. They build a Japanese house and garden. And you might say, oh, that looks rather not modern, and you would be right in a few senses. It's at MoMA, but what they've done is sort of a composite of a few different architectural motifs you would find in a 16th century warrior's home, but expanded to make displaying it easier in a few ways, like making the roof slightly broader than you would usually have so your visitors are better protected from the rain, expanding the walkways so you can have more visitors on it, etc. It's a Japanese architect who designs this. It's actually interesting, he's a modernist architect. He doesn't know how to do this work, so he talks to an architectural historian and some restoration, like carpenters as well, and together they come up with this design, which somehow, for MoMA, this is going to be this sort of the quintessence of modernity. Here you can see the walkway that's broadened so that it can fit more visitors down it. There were thousands of visitors. They actually opened it up in the summer of 1955 as well. The rooms, and this was talked about very much by American critics at the time, as showing all the reasons that everything that's wrong with American design. It's too fussy. This is like the mid-1950s, right? Tail fins, chrome, among other things. And people saying, look, this is how we should be designing. The Japanese got it right 5 centuries ago. Only a lot of times they don't say 5 centuries ago, they just say the Japanese got it right. So you have the Japanese trying to look modern, and then you have the Museum of Modern Art saying, Japan's perfect in the 16th century. So, just a few more images. And this is a much more complex story because we could talk about American impressions of Japan while living in Japan during the occupation. And I did jump over a few decades at the start of the 20th century. But, this is an exhibition from a Japanese designer in 1960, so the type of things that they're then doing, and this is very much about the selling of products like cameras, rice hookers, fans, so selling industrial products, and how do you do that to an American public who want to see this, or this is what they think Japan looks like, and Japan really wants to be selling them 8mm projectors. So they come up with this sort of splayed out, if you sort of exploded a traditional Japanese house and made it not symmetrical, but kept tatami rooms and added some functional Western-style kitchenware, what would you get? This is their attempt. Okay, so in closing then, just to going back to our questions, and I mean, maybe you have questions for me, but I think it would be great if we could talk about these issues that I did ask. Are we in a transnational and post-national age today? Is this kind of this sort of national branding display design, do we still have this? Are we past this? What are we doing instead? And how does this affect us? How does this affect you all with the specific type of work that you do, the way that you understand what design should be in the world, and how it can improve our world, and how you might use this type of display design to your advantage. So, thank you. That is my presentation. Rather a lot of information, but thank you for listening.